This image almost speaks for itself. Let's talk about a couple of other cases then of nation building through state formation that use the new technological instruments of the 19th century to effect this model of expansion with integration. I'm not going to spend any time on Canada, unfortunately, even though I'm a Canadian, but it's an important echo to what happens in the United States. But let's dwell on the US. Here we see very clearly now a way in which the United States, which once used to be referred to in the plural, now being increasingly referred to in the singular, as in the United States, through a process of integration of the various parts by expansion. Now, Japan and Germany integrated old feudal parts into something new. The United States did something very different. Canada, Brazil, other American New World countries had different ambitions, in part because they were the products of something new. They were not old feudal remnants. What they did have was a frontier. Most of the populations were hemmed in and close to coastal regions, and in a sense were old maritime colonies. The opening up of the hinterlands and the internal frontiers allowed these new areas of territorial expansion to be amalgamated to the older maritime bases of these colonies or post-colonial societies. And in this process, frontier expansion enabled the creation of new nations. Well, what did this ecological frontier, this ecological windfall look like from the frontier itself? Well, it was the land of opportunity. Here's a photograph of land grabbers being released in Oklahoma to rush out and stake claims to land. Indeed, what the frontier represented was an opportunity to expand farming, and the farmer almost becoming the icon of the nation builder, to fan out across these new territorial regions. Between 1800 and 1860, the number of U.S. farmers grew by 700%. This was an agrarian model of expansion. And it allowed the United States to integrate these new regions by turning these erstwhile frontier lands into arable territories. So it was a story of frontier expansion, but it didn't just happen without the state involved. In some cases, the state's actions were absolutely critical. In 1803, Thomas Jefferson acquired from France the territories of Louisiana, which opened up the regions west of the Mississippi Valley, which was crucial for U.S. expansion. In some cases, treaties and purchases like the procurement of Alaska later on in the 19th century had very similar effects. And in some instances, the ability to expand westward came through outright conquest. In some cases, the conquests came at the expense of indigenous peoples, and I'm going to come back to that. And in some cases, it came at the expense of adjacent states that had difficulty defending themselves against U.S. expansionism. And this was the case, particularly in the conquest of the southwest of the United States from Mexico. Either way, everywhere, frontier expansion meant the eviction, dislocation, or the containment of the incumbent populations. The people who were there, in a sense, before the land grabbing began, had to be either contained, as in reservations, or dislocated. It was very hard, and there was very little interest for instance, in integrating those whom they met into the existing system. This particularly affected the fate of Indians and Mexicans. Now, to this process was reinforced by important technological changes. For the land rush was emboldened by other innovations. In particular, the role of the plow in making commercial agriculture feasible. I'm using the plow here almost metaphorically because there was a whole set of innovations surrounding the plow that were important for opening up these frontier lands, making these frontier lands commercially viable. But in 1847, John Deere produced the first all-steel plow. This was a critical instrument because it was a much more durable, resilient instrument for overturning the sod and making it easier to cultivate the land. In 1834, Cyrus McCormick created an instrument known as the reaper, which was very popularly sold after 1855. All of this made commercialization of agriculture and the cultivation of new lands much easier, much more economical. And after 1860, the big breakthrough was the combine reaper harvester, which made the harvesting side of the business much more feasible. Then, at the time, there was even more power then when horses were then eventually replaced by tractors in 1920. So it was a series of important innovations which made farming commercially viable. And entire cities then would build on the backs of this process of the mechanization of agriculture, the process of bringing these territories that were once hinterlands into commercial production for the cultivation of agrarian staples like wheat and so forth, for shipment eastward to markets in the east and in some cases beyond. You can already get to a sense then of the ways in which the economic structure began to lay down the foundations for a political unification. But one of these cities that would emerge as a result of this opening was, of course, Chicago. First through the Erie Canal and later through railroads, Chicago became an internal hub for this newly expanding territorial empire, changing the entire marketplace for food. And one of the important repercussions is, of course, the decline in agrarian self-sufficiency as farmers increasingly become specialized in the production of particular commodities for sale in the marketplace. More and more food production then made by farmers with absolutely no intention of eating the food themselves, right? Keeping the urban populations or distant markets alive with the surpluses that they were able to produce. Just to go back to an important theme throughout this course. To give you an index of how this changes, by 1820, about 80% of the food production made in the United States was actually consumed by rural populations. 80% of the food production in the United States was consumed by the rural population itself. So there wasn't that much left over, 20%, for surplus that could be shipped to urban markets. By 1870, to give you a sense of how the transformation, this was down to 60%. So 40% of what farmers could produce could be sold to urbanites. This is important, for as there was vastly more food being produced through territorial expansion, and the share of that food that surpassed subsistence needs also increased, it allowed the United States to become one of the great bread baskets of the world, and for agrarian production in the United States to feed its growing urban population. Events like this, or processes like this, unfolded also in other New World societies like Canada and Brazil and Argentina. But really what I'm driving home here is the importance of frontier expansion for the development of an American economy and an American identity. This table, if we can have the students look at these numbers while I'm talking, contemplate these figures, they almost speak for themselves to give you a sense of the transformation that is happening in the rural population of the United States. Look at this set of figures alone. The number of farmers operating in the United States, from 600,000 to over 3 million. And of course, these farmers are becoming more and more productive while they're at it. This is an incredible miracle. Vast increases in the amount of food that could be produced and increases in the productivity of farmers allowed the sustenance for urban and distant populations. Many of these urban populations, in turn, came from immigrant stocks, right? Attracted by settlement laws, attracted by the opportunities presented by this expanding economy. Now immigrants began to move in, and in many cases to take advantage of these new opportunities for rural settlement, particularly after 1862 with the passage of the Homestead Act. So the state then plays a very important role. It acquires the territory that allows for the expansion of the frontier. It declares land laws that allow farmers to lay claim to parcels of land. I don't want to get too technical about this, but the Homestead Act of 1862 stipulates that what are called quarter sections of land, that's 160 acres, could be allotted to, under certain conditions, to anybody who could file for title. The states built up public schools, and all of this allowed for the integration of this expanding space into a national identity, right? Overcoming internal, regional, often linguistic and religious differences to share in this idea of the bounty and prosperity and principles of the American Republic. Of course, there were minorities that were excluded from enjoying the fruits of all of this: Indians, Mexicans, and most troublesome for this new nation, of course, slaves. In the end, slavery was the wedge for and imposed the limits, the ability for creating this new national identity, and it would drive the United States apart. There were, in a sense, two divergent models about how this frontier expansion would occur, one based on free labor and one based on slavery. And the expansion westward in itself could not resolve that fundamental difference between free and slave labor. And so the United States, for all of its efforts to overcome differences, was on a collision course towards war, culminating in the conflict between 1861 and 1865, which Americans call the Civil War. One effect of the Civil War, though, was in the end to create a centralized military machine once the war was over. And this military machine could be redeployed to pacify the remaining areas of frontier resistance to incorporation into the Republic. That is, that old army that was used in the Civil War could now be redeployed in the West, leading to the final defeat of those perennial threats to westward expansion, Indians. In this particular case, it's a story of a Comanche raid in Texas, a famous episode. The Comanches were one of those peoples who always resisted being incorporated into the United States. And the wars against the Comanches accelerated from the 1840s and, in a sense, led to a quasi-military occupation and mediation that would eventually bring the Comanches under authority. The same would happen in the United States in the South. As, in a sense, the military, while it was pacifying the West, the military also became the occupying force in the South, reconstituting itself now as the Freedmen's Bureau. In this particular case, in this image, you can see the image of the officer of the American nation now trying to resolve the conflicts between former slaves on this side and white populations on this side. The Freedmen's Bureau was a state institution. The state built, however incomplete and imperfect this process would be, and it would be imperfect and incomplete. It would take much longer to resolve many of these differences. It was nonetheless these state instruments that allowed the United States from evolving from the plural to the singular. But I want to stress that these new models of inclusion, of new territories and new peoples, did involve new patterns or reproducing old patterns of exclusion. So this short excursion into American history should illuminate global processes. The U.S. is part of worldwide developments. So let me conclude. By the middle of the 19th century, we see history going in several directions at once. Darwin is referring to this idea of our common origins, but everywhere we see nation building, new ways of imagining differences between people, now as differences between nations, with internal processes of integration through language, markets, political institutions, and schools to overcome the lines that segregated peoples within nations, however imperfectly that occurred. But now inscribing lines that separated nations from other nations, often using warfare as an instrument to build these new national identities. So states make war, and wars then make nations. But in creating a new and a potent model for political identities, it's important to bear this in mind because this was a feature of the global system that did not exist in 1750.